Okay. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of lands, seas and waters throughout Australia, particularly on the lands on which we each are meeting today, and pay respect to elders past, present and future. We recognise that the health and social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are grounded in continued connection to culture, country, language and community. Thank you. So Amy, Ross, Blake, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Welcome everyone. So great to see so many people on the line. My name's Amy Woods, and myself and Ross Herridge are taking over from some great work that Blake McLean has done in previous years in coordinating these New South Wales meetups. So yeah, firstly, we'd like to thank Blake for all the work that he's done previously. And hopefully Ross and I can fill, if only a small portion of your shoes. So welcome to this evening. The broad topic for this quarter's meetup around the country has been performance profiling and understanding the determinants in your sport, which we've loosely interpreted as looking for some different perspectives from different disciplines on what factors might determine performance in various sports. And I'll introduce our panel in a moment, but some brief housekeeping just before we start. We'd like to emphasise that whilst unfortunately we can't meet in person, we'd really like this event to be as interactive as we can. And we appreciate that a lot of you have probably been on Zoom all day. But we really encourage you to post any questions in the chat as we go, or pop your hand up if you wanted to ask a question, and we'll do our best to facilitate the responses as best we can. And as we mentioned, Blake is on the line, and we'd like to just acknowledge him as a member of the ESSA Sports Science Advisory Group. So Blake acts as a liaison to ESSA and provides members the opportunity for feedback or any issues or things to work on that ESSA might be able to address from various perspectives. So please feel free to reach out to him or any of the other members on the panel if you've got anything to flag with ESSA. And finally, as an ESSA event, your attendance does count towards your CPD points. So you'll just have to complete the self-assessment tool and submit it to your electronic logbook. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel, including Emma Hay, Sean Hardy, Tom Reddin, and Stephen Hughes. And I'd like to throw to each of you just to give us a brief background on your role and how you came to be involved with your current sport. So going along my screen here, I'll start with Steve. You want to kick us off?
Yep. Thanks, Amy. Yes, so my name's Stephen Hughes. I work at NSW as a physiologist, primarily with wheelchair basketball and rowing. I have been seconded with RA for 2021. So the majority of this year I've been with Rowing Australia, working in the Women's National Training Centre and travelling with them leading into and over Tokyo Games.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. Em, you're next on my list.
Thanks, Amy. My name's Emma Hay, and I'm a strength and conditioning coach with the New South Wales Institute of Sport. Currently, I'm working with the water polo and diving programs. Previous to that, I've worked in semi-pro and pro rugby league, as well as the Scottish Institute of Sport as well. In the institute system, we kind of get designated what sports we get to work with. So for me, getting put with diving was a sport that I had no idea about. And one day my boss said, next week you're starting. And I won't tell you what I said to him, but initial panic, and now fully embedded in the sport. Yeah.
Fantastic. Sean.
Evening, everybody. My name's Sean Hardy. I'm a senior physical performance coach at Cricket New South Wales, and I kind of head up the female side of things. So day to day, I look after the physical prep for our senior female state team, the Breakers, and I also look after the Sydney Sixers WBBL cricket franchise. And then I kind of filter down to coordinate with our newly appointed Thunder S&C and also our Pathways strength and conditioning coach, just to manage some of the age groups coming through. In a similar vein to Emma, I actually had no plans at all to work in cricket. I previously was working with the New South Wales Waratahs. I was in their under-20s program and helping out with some of their men's stuff. And after doing some private academy work with one of the state cricket coaches, I ended up getting wind of the fact that Sydney NSW was growing, and actually Tommy Reddin was helping grow his department and creating a new role in Pathways. And so I ended up cold calling and jumping across, and I'm still here 4 years later. So
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. And Tom, finally. Oh, you're just on mute, mate.
Thanks, Amy. I was just about to say that before I start, to say to Sean, you're rocking those glasses, mate. I like the look. Amy, yeah, I'm head of strength and conditioning and sports science at GWS with their Super Netball and AFLW programs, which are their two elite female sport programs. I'm pretty new to the role. I've only been there 6 months. We've just recently completed the Super Netball season, and we're about a month away from starting the AFLW pre-season, which excited to get a first turn at that as well. So that's my intro.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. And I'll throw to Ross to get us started with some of our discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. Welcome, everybody. And like Amy said, we want to try and make this as interactive as we can. So please use the chat. If you've got any questions, put them in there, or you know, just try and make it as interactive as we can. But otherwise, we've got a few questions to go through, and probably same way Amy did it. I'll probably start with Stephen, and then we'll just throw that open to the 4 panelists. So, starting a bit more globally, guys. Understand you've got between you, you've got a wide range of sport experience. And how do you work out what factors are important for your sport you're working with, processes you go through, etc., and how you do that for, you know, multiple sports. So if we start with Stephen with that one.
My first port of call really when undertaking new sport is generally a literature search. I try and see what's out there. I mean, most sports tend to have some review papers that have been done at one point or another, which have a good base for your sport. But you do have to be careful, just depending on review papers aren't done as often as individual papers. So depending when they were done, some of the rowing ones were done in 1980 and we only did 1K rows then. So like, it's not always accurate. So you might have to search a bit harder. But I think for most sports, you can find a lot of research papers on it. Apart from that, I think chatting with coaches and support staff, because I think support staff can often give you a different point of view that you may not get from the coach, or the coach may overlook. If a coach is, you know, a head coach has been involved with a sport for years, they may not even think that you need to know things that you don't know. While support staff might have been in a similar position to you a couple of years ago. So you find out a lot from support staff. And then apart from that, maybe just a normal internet search, like you can find things like, say there's been recent rule changes or something, there may be some differences in your sport which you may need to account for, which is not necessarily something where you are going to get that from a coach or a literature search. So sometimes they can be helpful as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And Emma, what about yourself? Is it a similar process, or is there any nuances to the sport you're working in?
Yeah, definitely some similarities. I think I have a really rigid process now after years of unsuccessfully doing it. So for me, I go the reverse to Steve. I go and try and embed myself in the sport as much as possible. So trying to never make assumptions and ask a lot of questions of the athletes, the coaches. Following that, I do the literature search, and that's because I tend to get biased by what I read and what I hear. So if I can initially make contact and understand the environment and the sport that I'm in, then the literature is kind of secondary to that, as well as building, like leaning on your network. So what does world's best look like? What are they looking at? How are they doing it? As well as the support staff, like Steve mentioned, they're invaluable to get people's experience who have actually been in the environment before. Next for me is I like to create models of performance, which is my own version of kind of creating, I guess, deterministic modeling versus a what it takes to win, and kind of with coach tactics written in a common language that kind of builds on what it takes to win. So for diving, it's as simple as scoring the most points, and then what are all the factors that contribute to that, and then building down to all the physical, the physics, the coaching and tactical requirements that need to build back into that ultimate goal, I guess. And then once that's distilled enough, I use that to pull out my testing protocols. So I know what stream we're actually working in to start to affect performance. And then that obviously leads into what we do day to day as strength coaches. So planning, periodization, individualization of programming and things like that. But that's come from a lot of mistakes previously.
Awesome. That's quite an interesting model you discussed there. I mean, how did you first come across sort of going down that path? Was it something you spoke to someone about, or just came across intuitively?
Definitely with help from colleagues along the way. So I'm a big fan of deterministic modeling, really taking it back to the physics and being very scientific about it, I guess. But I realized over the years that it's not necessarily the science that makes the program really good. So being able to, like in diving, they have their own language. So they talk about things differently. So how can I overlay that and then the coach tactics into it? And in the UK, they use the what it takes to win models, and I like that too. So it's kind of just pulling elements from all these other great ideas and pulling it into something that works functionally for our sort of environment.
Yeah, nice, brilliant. And Shawnee, what about your sport? It's a bit different to Stephen and Emma's.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. Like cricket's a really complex thing to unpack. My process has probably changed as well. I think initially, even getting into the sport and being quite a young S&C, I think you feel like you know much more than you actually do, and then you fall into the pit and realize that there's a lot of stuff you don't know. Cricket can be very humbling like that as well when you are in a skills dominant sport. I think the more that I've gotten into research, the more clarity I've had around kind of like tackling this question. And when I was writing notes on it, I just kind of came up with some simple things to go through. And like, I guess really the process is you're trying to paint a really clear picture or describe in plain language what elite performance looks like. And then you want to figure out how to measure it. And so for me, in terms of being able to describe performance, you've got to watch it live. You've got to use your own observations and be an applied scientist. And then you've also got to speak to people who know. And I think if you're lucky enough to have an analytics department, you've got to get into bed with them and work really closely with them, because they're already feeding back information to coaches and support staff that are seemingly meaningful interactions in the game that you're now in. So that's a really useful starting point. And then I think you can't discount the experience of coaches who may have been in the sport for 20 plus years and potentially played at a high level themselves. They'll have a view of the world and paint some things observationally that are really useful. And then I like the idea that that Steve brought up, and it's the other side of the coin, which is you have to do your due diligence and research, and that's going to flesh out things that don't get talked about in a skills context. And it might be common injuries in the sport that you're in. It might be some physical capacities and measurements that have previously been done. But once you've got that idea and you can like clearly articulate what really good elite performance looks like, then it's all about, well, for me anyway, trying to reverse engineer it back to how you can impact it. So if you can measure it directly, amazing. If you need a proxy to measure it, then figure out what that proxy is, and then figure out how you can get it into your training program. yeah, it feels like we're all on very similar themes.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I suppose, Tommy, interesting one for you is, you have to do this for two sports with AFL and netball as well. So anything to add to that in terms of the process? How have you gone around that?
Yeah, well, the way I went about it with netball, Roscoe, because I had to sort of hit the ground running there because I came in almost midpoint of their pre-season, was that I first off spent a lot of time watching the girls train with their netball, and even sessions where I wasn't sort of there to provide a strength and conditioning role, I just invested time in watching as much as I could in order to really get a feel for the physical demands of the game and the different demands of different positions and those sorts of things. And that was a way that I sort of approached it. But additional to that, like the other guys have said, asking questions of really experienced coaches. I've been very lucky that I'm working with probably the most experienced netball coach in the game in Australia, in Julie Fitzgerald. So asking questions of her, senior players, other practitioners who've worked as S&C coaches in netball, and really just asking a lot of questions and doing a lot of listening. And then probably the third part for me would have been the dive into research and articles and sort of literature. So maybe the same process elements that the other guys have talked to, but maybe just in a slightly different order. And maybe that's because I'm, I guess, more of a strength and conditioning coach than a sports scientist, that I sort of chose that watch movement as my first sort of go-to in the process.
No, fantastic. And I suppose my next question, I'm really interested or intrigued to hear your answers on this, but I'll go back to Stephen. So in your current sport, what are the factors that influence success? Obviously primarily, or not only physical, but mental, technical, tactical. And how did you go about establishing those factors, and have they changed sort of in your time in the sport?
Yeah, sure. I mean, rowing's very physiology-based sport. The aerobic capacity in rowing is a very large portion of it. I think the most recent research is about 80% aerobic, 20% anaerobic. So usually your elite athletes will have, for males, VO2 of over 6 litres, and women will have over 4 litres. Rowing tend to use absolute VO2. They don't use relative that often, largely because the body weight's supported, and they don't worry about body weight as much as, say, road cycling or running, as well as having a high anaerobic threshold, just for the end of the race, where they get their wind at the end. They're going to need a high anaerobic threshold for that, essentially go through pain. Anthropometric characteristics: rowers are usually tall, ideally have a large wingspan, because the combination of both will give them a longer stroke. And they usually will have high lean body mass, ideally, to make them strong and powerful to pull on the oar harder. Mentally, I think for rowers, they train a lot, high volume. For most Olympic programs, it's very high volume. I think we had, for our gold medal winning team, there was 730 workouts across the year. So they do roughly 2 to 3 workouts per day with 1 day off a week. So I think mentally, to get yourself through that, you have to be very driven, and relatively speaking, they don't get a lot of money compared to most professional sports. So, and then apart from that, also resistant to injury, just because they do very high volumes of training. They have to be very resistant to injury to get through and complete all those sessions. I think that those are the characteristics that are required of a rower. With testing, because all rowers row in crews generally, we don't have any single scullers at the moment in Australia, so everyone's rowing a crew. You can test for individual aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity. but then also you need to be technically efficient to be a good rower. And so you will have some rowers who may not be quite as good VO2, but if they're a better rower, they slow the boat down less and they produce more speed for the given effort. So they can still be very good without having as high VO2. So some of the testing has to be done on the water, and it can only be done at trials in boats with partners.
That's interesting. And just obviously 700 odd, I can't remember the exact number, 700 odd sessions a year is obviously pretty grueling. Just out of interest, sort of from a training perspective, I mean, what does the cross training element look like? I'm assuming that's not all rowing or weight.
No, so for the women's centre, roughly 25% of their weekly sessions are gym sessions. So they'll do 5 gym sessions a week. 2 will be dedicated core sessions, and 3 will be strength power sessions. And then majority of the other sessions are on water. I think about 16 sessions a week or something. And yeah, so the majority will be on water. There might be 1 or 2 erg sessions in there, and occasionally a run or a biathlon kind of thing with a bike and a run, just for some cross training. But yes, majority of their stuff is either gym or on water.
Yeah, awesome. And Emma, in your sport, I imagine that was quite an interesting task trying to find out the factors that influence it.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process too. So it's really funny. Until recently, I thought the physical and the technical side were the really important factors. And since the Olympics, it's funny, I've been in the sport 2 years, and because of COVID, I haven't seen them compete. But now I'm shifting that the mental side is actually more important for divers than any of the strength and technical stuff that we do. In terms of physical, though, diving is a strength and power sport. From a strength and conditioning side, we really just need to get them to jump high. So the higher they jump, the more rotations, the more points they can score. And it took me a long time to distill it down to a very simple effect like that. But then also looking at, I guess, resilience. So being able to hold your shapes in the air, that being able to enter the water safely and have strength around those really high impact forces. So for me, I mean, the biggest things that factor into the jump height are obviously we do predominantly strength testing in the gym, and then some jump testing on the force plates, and we look at the contribution of arm swing as well for the different takeoff positions. But what I'm starting to realize now is that the technical side, or at the elite level, most of them are technically proficient enough to be able to score 10s. They really psych themselves out though. So I know that we definitely don't put enough effort into the mental side of preparing for diving. And that was a comment from a lot of the athletes in trials was, oh, I just put the pressure on myself and I couldn't dive. And you see them do it 20 times perfectly in training leading up to the event. So yeah, that's a really interesting shift for me at the moment, and how we're going to look at that post games will be some very interesting chats in our performance team meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. About how you go through that as well, because obviously with the Olympic cycle, it's, you know, you're building up to this thing 4 years away or sometimes longer, you know. So but moving on to Sean, obviously in cricket, how have you gone through that process of finding out the different influences?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a journey. Like I said before, you come in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and certainly coming from a contact winter sport where S&C kind of goes hand in hand, probably with most of the training drills. You know, cricket is a massive contrast to that. Like ultimately, and I've just like kind of ranked them here in terms of like technical, tactical, mental, and physical. I think you can't get away from the fact that cricket is skill dominant. You know, there's a reason that elite men and women in cricket do the things that they do, and they're special people. And it's a really hard technical skill to be able to do some of the things that they do. So I think without that, ultimately reflecting on some of the most successful teams in the men's and the women's game, the athletes that have that really, really pure technical ability drive large amounts of success for their teams. You know, underpinning that it's really interesting because cricket, there's a lot of waiting around, but there's also a lot of this like interplay in terms of what tactics are going on. And I think an athlete's ability to play a chess game rather than checkers, when it's bat versus ball as a bowler or a batter or a captain in the field, and kind of drive outcomes. Again, definitely in short format cricket, the sides that have tactically proficient captains and good athletes in their teams definitely succeed more. It's interesting talking about the mental stuff in diving. I think, we're in an advent where it's not just the All Blacks that travel with a full-time psych anymore. A lot of elite sports are getting on board that. And like the mental part of cricket is huge, because ultimately it's about trying to get into this rhythmic switching on and switching off and switching on and switching off, because there's a period where you want to be in the contest when the ball's live, but cricket takes so long, and to casual observers, there's heaps of standing around. But if you've got a really good athlete that continuously burns that energy because they can't switch off in between contests, then they're probably going to be absolutely mentally shot halfway through the game, which is going to lead to bad outcomes. So I think the mental part is also really important. And then, it's ironic that as an S&C coach, I'm failing to mention the physical work until fourth, and like all of these things are important. I guess they're all kind of linked to each other, but I think the first job from a physical point of view is giving our athletes really high work capacity. And what I mean by that here is you want them to be able to tolerate really high training loads, because that way they're going to be able to sharpen their technical and their tactical skill sets. They want lots of exposure to lots of tactical training sessions and lots of exposure to matches with high availability to ultimately drive those tool sets. And then just like every other sport, and we're kind of seeing this in the female game a lot at the moment, speed and power are coming to the fore as things that are also in their own right becoming a determinant of success. Power hitting in the women's game is becoming a really, really important thing. And teams that have athletes that can clear the boundary are winning games and tournaments. So yeah, I think it's all important, but I think ultimately in cricket, it's definitely technical at the top of the tree.
And just on that power hitting there, Sean, I know you're doing some research into sort of power hitting in the female game. Just a brief summary on what you're finding at the moment as being the key factors to clearing the boundary ropes, which is obviously a massive part, especially in the female game.
Yeah, this is a good shameless plug for my own research. We're actually getting our first paper out. Hopefully this month will be the first sensor validated in cricket to measure bat speed. But effectively, and it comes back to kind of understanding what's important in the game. In short format cricket, power hitting in the women's game is a determinant of success, but we're really poor at measuring that. And we don't even really have a good ability to measure rotational power as a proxy. So we've done a couple of things and like run a few correlations and gotten girls in the nets and done some testing. And at the moment, we're kind of seeing a couple of profiles come through. It's interesting because at the same time, a group in the UK is doing the same research from the other end of the spectrum, looking at biomechanics in Loughborough, and they're kind of finding that men and women have quite different physiological patterns of power hitting, and their joint angles and things are quite specific and quite different, probably because there's inherent sex differences between men and women, and like the way you accelerate an object is different. But what we found is, upper body strength and rotational power are really key for women. And that's because when they play their most powerful shots, they don't extend their arms into that kind of, if you think of a baseball or even a golf shot where that front arm kind of flattens out completely. Women don't tend to do that. Even the most successful kind of biggest power hitters in the game in an Australian context, it might be Ash Gardner or Elisa Healy, they play with a bent arm. And it seems to be that upper body strength is a really key determinant for success there.
That's really interesting. And I think the difference between the male and female in that power hitting is you're just opening the door with that. So yeah, really exciting stuff. But Just moving on to Tom. Obviously, Tommy, you've just gone into netball and you know have had a pretty successful season. I'm sure making the final, but you would have gone through a process there of either working out or understanding during the course of the tournament, you know, what the key factors of success are from the sort of four things we've spoken about. So how have you found that, and what are the things that have stood out for you?
Yeah, obviously I'm still new, Roscoe, and learning, but I think netball is a great example of a sport where it's got a really even balance across those four areas. But even in that, there's subtle differences across a netball court in position. So, you know, the mid-court players probably need a little bit more physical qualities than some of the, you know, end-court players. And the end-court players maybe need, particularly the shooters, a bit more of that technical skill with their shooting. If their shooting skill isn't on point, then you know, that has a big impact on their performance and the game. So I think it's quite even across the four areas. Interestingly, I've watched a lot of netball at the level below, so Sydney Premier League netball, and my impression of that is that there's a lot of great athletes at that level. The athleticism isn't, you know, drastically inferior to elite level. What seems to be the difference, in talking to the head coach, it's really around game sense, and I guess that is part of that technical bucket that you're talking to. So with that in mind, I guess more and more training in netball is trying to, you know, focus on tactical or game style, game sense, and then can we blend physical qualities within that game style of training. So in some ways, it's like other sports such as soccer and AFL, I think, where that game sense and tactical part is a big determinant, and you try and blend in physical training within that training.
Yeah, nice. And I know the AFLW season's not quite started yet, but I know you've got a bit of a background in that. I mean, is there any differences when you talk about AFL?
Oh, look, hopefully this comes across the right way. Like, my impression of watching the girls with AFLW, and I think it's pretty well understood, is, again, the difference, say, of AFLW and AFL is just the game sense. And it's only because a lot of the girls haven't played a lot of football, you know, to this point, whereas like for like in the male space, you know, a male player at 20 years of age might have played 200 games of football all through their development, from when they were young boys through to, you know, grown men playing AFL, whereas an AFLW girl might have only played 20. So they've had a tenth of the exposure to games and game training. So that is the big rock probably in AFLW, technical as well. So the focus is really, we need to emphasize game training to get the girls better quickly, and how can we physically achieve what we want to within game style drills at training.
Yeah, really interesting. And I suppose anyone listening in, if anyone's got any questions on any of that, like we said at the start, stick them in the chat. But Amy, I'll pass on to you for sort of talking a bit more about the Olympic sports.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Yeah, so I suppose Emma and Steve, we might just jump back to you guys and focus a little bit on, the recent Tokyo experience. I know for myself, in lockdown here, it was a game changer every day to be able to just get the TV on and focus on that day to day. But Steve, can you tell us what, I suppose, if anyone wasn't watching, say, the rowing day to day, what did that Olympic program sort of look like? Was it, heats, finals, etc.? And how does preparing for the Olympics, differ? And was there anything sort of specific that you needed to account for in preparing for Tokyo?
Yep. So rowing has heats, semi-finals, finals, depending on which cruise you're in. The eights have less crews because they have more people on a boat, so they won't necessarily have as many heats or semi-finals. But essentially they'll go through generally all three of those. And with rowing, because it's slightly dependent on wind, they don't want disadvantages to crews based on the weather conditions. They generally have like a spare day, and they can move the schedule around based on that. So for this campaign, the girls who were in the four, two of them were actually doubling up in the pair. So they, on their first day of heats, they had to race their pair, and then they had about a 2-hour break before they then had to race in the four. And for them, ideally, they were only going to have to do that in the heat day, but because we then had days lost due to the higher winds, they ended up having to double up again on the gold medal day for when they competed in the four. So they had to compete in the four, which they won the gold medal. They then had to go do the medal ceremony because you can't get out of it. And then basically get off the podium, get onto bikes, try and refuel them as best as we can for their pairs race, which was now a semi-final, not a heat, in 2.5 hours they had. So they're probably about 2 hours once they got off the podium to try and prepare for that. And in the end, they missed out because they got fourth in their semi-final for the pairs. However, if they hadn't had to double up again on that day due to lost time, they probably would have made it through to their final, had a good shot at getting on the podium for the pairs as well. And that's just one of the changes that can happen in the rowing because of the conditions. Mm-hmm. For, as I said, the training, the leading into the Olympics, the rowers train a large amount. So they're training 3 times a day for 4 days a week and 2 times a day for 2 days a week. And then they have 1 day off, which is Sunday. And they pretty much do that all year round outside of when they're competing. For rowing, they usually have an overseas racing competition period, which goes from May till July, when not in an Olympic year. And then they have like World Championships in September. But obviously because of COVID, there was no travel this year. So leading into this Olympic Games, Rowing Australia held simulation regattas around Australia to try and get them some racing experience without having any real racing. And I believe New Zealand must have done something similar, and both New Zealand and Australia went pretty well in rowing. So some of the other countries now are wondering whether or not overseas racing is as necessary as they thought it was. But that was something which in a normal year, they would just go overseas in May and race the 3 World Cups and then come back and then go back in August for the World Championships. So that was a difference this year. The other thing was just preparing the athletes for the heat. Obviously with rowing being outdoors, we had to prepare them to race in the heat. So for the women's centre, we started them with heat training in May. And we basically had a 10 metre by 4 metre greenhouse, which we borrowed from sailing and that idea. So we could get 8 to 10 athletes in there. And we just use space.
That's more cozy than we had.
Yeah, no, we get a lot of athletes in there, and we'd basically just put space heaters on. And so they could then do their normal water sessions, get off the water, put their boat away, and then get right into the heat chamber, which was a lot more efficient than having them have to go to the New South Wales Institute of Sport to use the heat chamber there, or go to the yoga studio down the road. So that was like a pretty good option for efficiency. And then when we were in our pre-staging camp in Rockhampton, we had something similar where we hired out a room in a hotel, their conference room, and they allowed us to crank that up and turn that into a sweat box as well. And basically that was just to help them cope with the heat. When we were over there, we just had a whole bunch of heat strategies. So it was, for the men, they would do pre-cooling before their races because the men would tend to get affected by the heat more than the women just because of the bigger mass. And all the athletes would take slushies like 90 minutes beforehand. And then post-competition was just trying to cool them as effectively as possible and then get them back into the air-conditioned room. That was probably our biggest things, the biggest hurdles we had to deal with in Tokyo. Apart from that, I think it was similar to their normal regattas. And yeah, we're just a bit unlucky with the change in schedules as well. But that was basically their Olympic run-up.
Great. And I'm interested to hear, I suppose, what sort of recovery strategies and things you guys might have done, I guess, within the regatta. And you touched on it a little bit with the girls who had to back up between the four and the pair, but are there any specific recovery strategies that you guys employed?
Our athletes, we weren't allowed recovery baths at the venue, which is different from every other regatta. So the bus trip was only about 25 to 30 minutes from the course to the Olympic Village. And because the Australian headquarters had a recovery centre, we essentially would book them in every day of the Olympics that were there, and we would get them all to go through after their races or training. So basically, they would get off water. We would try and cool them down with vests or ice towels. They'd go into the room, generally get something to eat, refuel, get on the bus, and then go back to the centre. And we'd pretty much have the booking half an hour or 45 minutes after they'd finished, so they'd be able to go straight there. Though they were pretty lenient anyway at the recovery centre, so we could get them in most times without much of a fuss. For the girls who were backing up, same thing, except we didn't have any ice baths there, so we basically just cooled them a bit with vests, and then try to refuel them as best as possible. They would usually top up their slushy before their second race, and then try and keep them out of the heat as much as possible on the way to the boat to when they went back out to warm up, because they're usually on the water 40 minutes before racing anyway. So we generally try and keep them out of the sun as much as possible until they're basically on the water.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And Em, flicking to you, I'm sure, your experience in diving, I know myself as an armchair judge, I couldn't quite figure out, what was going on in some of those dives. Can you explain a little bit about, what actually sort of determines a medal, particularly in diving?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think it's a combination of everything. I mean, if we look at Mel, who did win the bronze medal, it's about skill, it's about talent, and then developing that talent. Preparing right, gosh, a willingness to succeed, I think, is a big one for Mel, but it's also it's a very interesting one. Again, I think it comes back to the psychology of the sport and how they can actually learn to block out everything else that sort of goes alongside it, because competition is not the hardest physically. They need to, competition's easier than training. So in competition, the women will do 5 dives, the men will do 6. And on a regular training day, they can have up to 30 dives of those dives that they do. So competition's a very interesting one where it's not the hardest they'll physically have to work or physiologically have to work. And again, it's about figuring out how to best support yourself and surround yourself with people who can support you to make sure that you're in the right frame of mind to execute everything that you do on a daily basis. So yeah, it's a very interesting one, because you see them all in training and they can all do perfect 10s, and then it comes to the games and other factors sort of take over. So I find that a really hard question to answer, because it's all of it, isn't it? Like, just what determines a medal? Gosh, it's everything, and it's individual.
And it's all over so quickly that
and I have no idea how they get if they do a bad dive, how they recover and then perform in the next one. So I know we have a couple of divers who are sitting underneath that, our elite level, who will do a bad dive in training, for example, and then the whole session's ruined. So being able to block that out and then continue to be absolutely perfect, like the perfection in this sport is like nothing I've ever experienced, because in your team sports you make a mistake, you can come back from that in a diving competition, especially at like the Olympic level. If you do one bad dive, then you're done and you only get 5 attempts. And honestly, I still don't know how they do it. I have no idea.
Did the crowd, or I suppose lack of, does that play into performance at all, do you think? Or is it more that, like, I suppose, yeah, not having crowd, do you think that would have made it easier to block everything out? Or
I had those discussions with the team. I had worked closely with 3 of the 7 divers that were over there, and really they train with no crowd, so it's not too dissimilar to what they do. But we have one guy who gets really hyped up by the support, so I think he would have actually done better if there was a crowd, because he thrives off that, the crowd involvement, the attention that he gets. He loves it. Whereas there are a few other people who are just like, no, this is just like normal training, it's no problem, we just have longer waits because we've got to wait for everyone else to dive. So yeah, it's very individual again. But there actually did end up being quite a crowd when they let a few people in, so it didn't actually seem as empty as it possibly seemed on TV, which good.
Good one, thank you. And I suppose Sean and Tom, with more of a week-to-week match cycle versus, say, a 4-year kind of Olympic campaign, how might that sort of differ in terms of the preparation for your sports? So Sean, what would you say are kind of your non-negotiables each week, kind of making sure that your athletes are ready to go come game day? I suppose factoring different travel and things like that. How do you sort of structure your training and recovery and things to ensure that I suppose performance is optimal when it needs to be?
Yeah, I think obviously considerably different to Olympic prep. It sounds, on one hand, I feel like it's a double-edged sword. Like, it sounds amazing to be able to design like a single plan that builds over 4 years, but you probably also then are under a lot of pressure. It's really interesting hearing all this stuff about the diving and the mental prep and that sort of thing, having perfect practice and imperfect performance. Like, just watching the Olympics, I found it fascinating to see, even in the gymnast doing the same thing. Like, if you fall off the beam and then you have to get back on and complete your routine. But changing gears, like, I think for us, week to week performance, it's about having a really even keel and getting into a rhythm quickly, and knowing that really, if you don't perform in round 1 and win enough games early, you don't get to play in the finals. So we don't have the luxury of kind of aiming to peak later. Like, we need to be ready to go from day dot. And I think what that reflects in our training week in the female side of things, we prepare either for T20 cricket or 50 over cricket. So it's either a 3-hour match or kind of an all-day match. Things that are common to both of those preparation weeks, we'll always look at a high-speed running dose and kind of measure week to week what the athletes are exposed to in games, and then make sure that they touch within kind of 95% of their max speeds at a given volume within that 7-day cycle. We'll definitely lift. We lift kind of all year round. There's definitely a change of gears between pre-season and in-season programming, but we'll continue to chase some longer term development goals for different athletes. It might be max force production or something around rate of force development, but we'll definitely lift. And then the running is a bit more targeted. Fast bowlers have a really tough job in game. They cover 10 to 12K. They bowl a lot at training. They cover a lot of on-feet load already. So they probably get a hall pass for more of the intense running. They might do something light, and then the rest of the group will still run. And I guess on top of all of that, they'll get through 2 major skills sessions in a week. A 7-day turnaround is a little bit unique in our environment. At the moment, our state or our 50 over tournament schedule keeps changing. It kind of ends up being on a fortnight, but just operate off a really simple schedule that's kind of game day minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and try and structure, our big intense stuff further away. So, you might sprint and have your main training sessions game day -4, and gradually kind of taper off into game day -2, -1, where it's a light skill session and maybe a captain's run kind of on the field and some gameplay, and then rinse and repeat, and yeah, just try and maintain as even a keel as possible week to week.
Great. Thank you. And Tom, any sort of similar or different experiences for you?
Yeah, reasonably similar, Amy. In netball, we sort of had models for a 5-day turnaround, 6-day turnaround, 7-day, 8-day, 9-day turnaround. So we had several different models of training based on what the turnaround between games, and then we also had variations of that based on whether it was a away fixture or a home fixture. What happened this year, of course, with COVID is that a lot of that went out the window, and we found ourselves having to plan a lot on the run, which in some ways was a real challenge, but in some ways was also a lot of fun in trying to really piece together the training variables to maximise the performance that was next in sequence. And one of the things I guess COVID has shown many of us, and certainly it showed me through the netball season, was that even when what you think is the best plan doesn't happen, you can still get really great performance outcomes if everyone bands together and you really maximise what you can get done in the time available. From a netball perspective, in terms of non-negotiables, I guess we are a bit mindful of the fact that the girls play on quite a hard surface, so we don't have a lot of back-to-back court days with the girls. We'd probably only ever have 2 in a row before we'd absolutely have a day off court. And then the other thing is that we try and make sure that in the middle of each of those cycles that I talk through is a free day. So we really try and have that after the game. The first part of the week is reviewing the game, tidying up any training, a bit of heavy S&C, similar to what Sean talked about. And then we have a midweek break, which acts as a nice sort of mental reset to then look ahead to the next fixture. And all training is then geared to that fixture. So really our week is split into 2 parts, with that off day in the middle acting as a nice separation point between the two parts.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. And seeing a couple of questions coming through on the chat here. One from Katie Slattery for Emma. How did diving account for a lack of international competition before the games?
Yeah, that was hard because I think the international competition is probably the exposure to international competition is definitely a determinant of success, like we talked about earlier. What we tried to do was create mock competitions. So we actually went through the processes in training. We did have a competition up in Brisbane, and that was when Brisbane first got hit with COVID as well. So we got cut short after day 1 and had to fly all the way back. But so we only had so I've been working in diving for 2 years, and we had the 1 Olympic trials and Olympics, and they're the only 2 competitions I've seen. So we did a lot of work in training to really try and mimic what the Olympics were going to look like, and making sure that we could just expose them to those single effort dives, and making sure they could go through the process, which that's about all we did.
Great. Thank you. And I suppose coming back to some of our original discussion about looking at different parts of literature and things to try and discover a potential new sport. Vincent's asking, what keywords would you search for when doing a literature search? Maybe Sean?
Oh, I thought Steve was going to get this question, but I reckon, you'd probably want to put the qualities that you think are associated with the sport. If I was doing a lit search in cricket, I'd put power and rotational power. I'd put upper body strength, and then I'd tag the sex that you're working with. And then, you know, some common terms in the sport, you know, I'd definitely put cricket in there. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think you usually end up trawling through a systematic review and then going to their reference list and looking for the papers that kind of stood out to you, and you kind of go down a rabbit hole that way. That's kind of how I've done my lit searches. But happy to open it up.
I had a look at like my Zotero, and it looks like majority of the papers that look like it might be a broad analysis sport, they generally start with like relationship between something and your sport, or factors of something performance, or prediction of something performance, or physiology of something performance. So I think if you just put in some of those words and your sport name, it'll give you something to start with. The other thing is sometimes, even if it's not like a big review paper or something, if you find just a small paper, often in the introduction, they'll talk about the basics of the sport. So you can often they'll have it in their introduction, and then you just go to their citations and steal it from there.
We love some official plagiarism. Not endorsed. JM is asking, with athlete profiling, how do you use the data or results in sports where performance has little to do with specific fitness profiles? So as an example, women's diving being won by very young athletes, or sports like, say, water polo, cricket, some netball positions. And by fitness, he means all aspects, including strength, power, speed, etc. Maybe Tom. So the question is there in the chat if I've misinterpreted that at all, or maybe JM, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Not Johnny Marsden, is it?
Oh, maybe.
I wonder if it is.
Maybe.
Yeah, probably.
Ah.
Right, John.
Well, welcome, John.
Yeah, I suppose where I'm coming from here is, you know, sort of a lot of sports that you guys are working with, you know, sort of the physical profile, the profiling that we do with our athletes, you know, sort of like that doesn't actually determine who's going to win or who performs really well. So in your specific sports, how do you know, sort of use the data then, and actually, you know, sort of sometimes can be quite hard justifying it with coaches and the athletes themselves as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a crack at that. I mean, netball, John, does have a reasonable, I think, link with physical qualities in most positions, but you could make a strong argument that some of the best goal shooters in the world aren't super athletic from a physical perspective. And we see that even in Suncourt netball. The best shooter is probably not the most athletic person going around. So I think it's still value in doing some profiling, and really the conversation, I think, steers towards, can we make the athlete better? And therefore, can the team be better if the player can improve in some of those athletic qualities that you're talking to? Does it mean that they can't be a great player if they're not, you know, super fit, strong, powerful? No, but can they be better? Well, the answer is probably yes. So that's how I'd approach it.
I think in rowing, not every person has the same sort of look or body type, and not everyone has the same VO2 max. And I think that's where generally like their racing tends to show that more. I mean, in rowing, they do a 2K erg multiple times a year as sort of a metric of where they're at. And we have, you know, an athlete who might be in the bottom third of the group, but because she's so technically proficient, she moves the boat better than all the others. And so I think that's where, just when they race on the water, the coaches can see the difference. It's a bit hard we can't test them on the water as easily. It's a bit hard. It's more a coach's eye, and you can see in the results how they do. And so you can see athletes come through who may not be as great physiologically speaking, but they have something else which we can't test for in a lab.
Yeah, so it sounds like you sort of maybe take some guidance or some, take some of those testing results as information, and use it to perhaps inform, some things that you're doing, but maybe that's not always the be all and end all.
In terms of rowing, like when they select the national team, the trials regatta will be racing on water. They will also do an ergometer, but it's all put together to decide who should be in the boat based on who works well together, who's a bow side, who's a stroke side. Everything gets taken into account, not just your lab tests.
Yeah.
Steve, can I ask, when you're racing on the water and you're selecting for a crew, are they racing in single sculls? Are they doing individual?
No. So what they do is they'll do racing where like you might have two fours, so 4 people in each boat, and they'll basically either time trial or race next to each other, and then they'll swap 2 people, one into the other boat, and then they'll race them again. And so you look at the differences between times, and then you'll swap another 2, and then you look at the difference between times. And so essentially you'll do that 3 times, and then you'll have everyone in the crew technically raced against the other one. That's kind of the best you can do, because like particularly with the rowers who row sweep, where they only have 1 oar, they not technically very good at single scull. And because they sweep row with 1 oar, then it's not reflective of how good they are. So with trials, they'll do some racing in pairs, and then they'll use the pairs to decide who goes in the fours, and then they'll do those races where they swap them around to decide how everyone goes in the fours, and then you use that to select your crews. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So sort of starting in smaller boats and then just gradually working up and up until
so the pairs will have the pairs will have 2 rowers, and they'll both be sweep 1 oar each, and then they'll just go from there. They'll get them all to race, then they'll start putting them in fours, which is again 1 oar each, and then they'll swap those around to get an idea of how fast each person is in a boat.
Yep. Do you guys use any slow-mo footage or like analytics in terms of like trying to quantify rowing efficiency, or like?
They will do biomechanics as well. So you can have force gated with strain gauges on the gate. So they'll do biomechanic analysis as well. And so that's fairly common. In the women's squad, we do it a couple of times a year, and they'll usually do it once the crews are selected, not beforehand. So once the crews are selected, then they'll start doing biomechanics more often to try and get the best setup for their boat.
Sorry, Amy, I was just really interested in that.
No, absolutely. And probably on a similar vein, I've got a question. Whether any wind tunnel testing has been applied into particularly rowing to determine position and technique refinement. Does that sort of happen within Rowing Australia, or is that sort of maybe something more overseas,
not that I'm aware of. I'm guessing there has been some sort of wind tunneling on individual boats, but not on crews. Only because I think you probably have less luxuries in rowing on where your body is compared to cycling. Just because you have to go through the movement, you have to bunch up at a catch, and then you have to go all the way through the movement. You can't reduce your body size that much in that. But I'm almost certain there must be wind tunneling done on boats from the boat manufacturers.
Yeah, the actual boat construction probably.
Yeah, I would imagine they definitely do.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. And and cycling's probably a big one that sort of testing gets done in as well. Yeah, great.
I think technique refinement is more biomech rather than wind tunneling. It's more looking at whether or not they're slowing the boat down in the catch. So ideally you want to not slow your boat down as you go in when you're recovering. So some athletes are better at that than others, because you have to move forward. You ideally want to have the boat move underneath you instead of like pulling yourself forward aggressively, because if you do, you can slow the boat down. So it's more looking at those things, I think, rather than drag.
Yeah, great. And I can see Damo's on the line here, who's biomechanist, done a fair bit with rowing. So I'm sure any further questions around some specific biomech stuff can probably head Damo's way offline.
Damo can correct all the technical errors I just made in my descriptions.
So conscious, we don't want to keep everyone for too long, but interested in just a couple of final points, and probably, you know, maybe imparting a little bit of advice for maybe some of our newer practitioners or even some students that might be on the line. What challenges, and we might start with Emma here, what challenges do you see for new practitioners coming into your sport? And what advice might you have for anyone sort of starting out in that role? And probably particularly along the lines of maybe balancing some different perspectives on the sport, and maybe, you know, what you might see in terms of performance versus maybe someone who's been there for a long time. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely, and this might answer some of Damo's question in there as well. Yeah, in diving, it's actually a very challenging environment to work in, because it doesn't have a lot of the history that other sports have, I guess. So there's it's challenging in the fact that a lot of what we do isn't really documented. So there's no standards, there's no norms, we're kind of working our way through to see what works and what doesn't. And in that can be a lot of perspectives and challenges. So on a day-to-day basis, I think there's always challenging conversations and always different perspectives, especially working in a performance team. I guess in a high-performance sport environment, if that didn't happen and everyone just was happy to go along and get along, then that's probably not going to push innovation or excellence either. So, I mean, if I'm talking about balancing differing opinions, I think building trust first is always the best way to go. So being a part of the team, working hard to actually build that trust within your team, because then you can have that platform for more challenging conversations, and it's understood that I guess everyone's moving in the same direction. It's everyone's trying to make the athletes the best. You're not taking personal attacks on people. It's all professional. I mean, my always my first point is to seek first to understand, in a bit of Stephen Covey, but in challenging conversations is because you don't know how that person's come to that point. There's always a million different ways to do the same thing, in particularly in S&C and sports science. So not making assumptions, I guess, on other people's opinions as well, and look to understand how they operate. I think it's important to take the emotion out of things as well. I know when I was a junior coach, I'm an emotional person, but I got very emotional when there was differing ideas. I always felt like it was an attack on me, and not, you know, that challenging conversation to push everyone to be better and work on the same thing. So for me, I think taking the emotion out of it and understanding that it's not professional. And sometimes it comes to a point where there is no compromise, and sometimes you just have to let some people fail before you're able to have that conversation for change and try new ideas as well. And yeah, I think if I go back to Damo's question in the chat, I think for me it's been careful progress, because a lot of it is just coaches' opinions, and the way they've always done it is how they're doing it now, and it's really hard to take those steps. And so it is slow, very, very slow process. I'm not sure I've answered everything in your question there, Amy. That was a loaded one.
All right, I like these loaded questions. Yeah. And Ross is going to, he can filter out all of my sort of babble.
Yeah, I was actually keen to get everyone's insight into Damien's question there. I'll read it out in full. He said, how mature are your sports you work in regards to sports science, i.e. using athlete profiling to identify gaps or strengths, and then to problem solve, etc.? Do you need to take time to carefully make progress in this area, or do you have strong support from your coaches / multidisciplinary team? Really interested in your thoughts on that, because I think that's a great question. I'm actually I'll go to Tommy first. Just with any of the environments you've been involved, sort of how has that been incorporated in? Is it something you've had to do to make change or to get buy-in, or are you just sort of able to just crack on and do what you need to do?
It's a good question. Netball and AFLW, they're quite, well, netball is not a new sport, but maybe it's new to really embracing strength and conditioning and sport science. AFLW is a new sport. So I'd say neither of those are mature in so far as they've got a great bank of experience and history in sports science and strength and conditioning. But what they do have is they have great enthusiasm for those areas to come in and try and find ways to make a difference. That's not to say that the sports are happy for you to come in and just do whatever you like. You have to provide justification and rationale for what you want to try and implement. But one of the really exciting things for me, Ross, at GWS is that they are quite open in those two sports to really looking at ways to improve the performance of the athletes or make the athletes more robust from an injury perspective, and how can we go about doing that? Now, there's not a lot of research in either of those spaces at this point in time, so that's hopefully another opportunity down the track. But that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, great. And I'd probably like to push this one onto Sean as well. Like, Sean, how have you used sort of athlete profiling in your space? Has it been a part of rehab processes, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think if we're thinking about using the profiling to identify gaps and strengths, I think female cricket does that really well in an injury context. I think, we're lucky with the Triple SM team and the processes that we have in place. They're really kind of criteria based and driven and quite comprehensive, and there's good buy-in across like a very wide team of people, including skilled staff, to make sure when we return an athlete, they go through checks and balances in a number of areas. If we look at the flip side of the coin and we're talking about healthy athletes, I think we're getting there. We in the female side of the game, we are probably leveling up to a new version of athlete profiling at the moment. We've had, and I think a lot of sports go through this, but we've had the basic level of some strength and fitness assessments and some power assessments that are kind of rolled out nationwide with varying levels of compliance, and they're now quite well embedded into the systems. And they certainly, speaking to the question before, they don't accurately describe elite performance on the field, but they're important kind of minimum standards. And I think we're starting to make ground on measuring things that are much more specific, looking at the reactive strength index of our fast bowling group and tracking how that changes in competition, looking at rotational power measures. And, now we've got a bank of work that's 18 months old with lots of data around it, can start to describe, elite female bat speed a bit better. I think we're getting better tools to figure out where the gaps are. But I don't think we're nearly at the point that potentially, I'm pulling this out of my hat, but potentially for somewhere like, Cycling Australia to talk about an individual athlete's position on a bike and use biomech to change that and collaborate and kind of change their performance. We're not at that level yet.
No, great. And it sounds interesting. It sounds like it's really evolving for everyone in their space. I mean, Stephen, you briefly spoke about it, but how is it for the rowers? I imagine it's a pretty important part for them.
We're quite, we're in rowing, like rowing's been in the Olympics since the first games. So sports science has been in rowing for quite a long time. With a very old sport, they got on board with it a lot earlier. However, it's different depending on what level of rowing. So like at the national level, sports science is standard, and both the men's and the women's centre have a sports scientist full time. At the club level, it's not, you don't have as much sports science involvement, and not all coaches are very keen to have sports science involved. So I think in that sense, it's still trying to get good relationships with coaches to allow you to work with them and maybe profile their athletes more frequently and provide more feedback to them. But yeah, it's still a work in progress for all clubs. Some clubs, depending on where their coaches have coached before, are very familiar with it, whilst others have not had any sports science before. So I think it depends really on the level that you're working at.
No, interesting, and it can be a challenge, like you say, if different standards have got different challenges with the coaches as well, you know. So yeah, but no, thanks for your question there, Damien. That was a great one. One more we'll take from JM. Is there anything new sports science wise happening in rowing as a sport compared to 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, the biggest change that I saw was that, as I said, the women used to do 1 kilometer races. So 30 years ago, the research said that there was a much higher anaerobic contribution in rowing in general. In sports science, I think GPS is fairly big now. So there's probably more biomechanics and more GPS analysis than before. For the national teams here, they'll get GPS analysis on the men's centre. Probably 95% of their on-water sessions will have GPS analysis and reports. Sorry, not race reports, just reports on their sessions. And because in rowing, world's best times, they can compare their on-water speeds to world's best times, and you can use that. So when we had our simulation regattas this year, not being able to race overseas, we could still compare our times to world's best times. And we know that if you have a time which is roughly 97% of world's best time, then you're in a shot for getting a medal at the Olympics, and means you're able to actually assess that without racing against anyone else. And that meant we knew we were in a good position going over.
No, fantastic. Well, like we said, slightly conscious of time. We've gone over a little bit, but it's been some great questions coming in, and some good discussions as well. I'll probably first like to start by thanking the 4 panelists who have come on this evening: Sean, Emma, Stephen and Tom. It's been fantastic. I really appreciated your time there, and it's been some really interesting insights into 4 very unique and different sports, or 5. So thank you very much there for your time this evening. CPD points, which we discussed at the beginning, guys. So yeah, I think if you've got any more information on that, Amy or Kelly.
I think Kelly might. I believe it's just through your electronic logbook online. Is that right, Kelly?
Yes, that's right. So this is a learning activity. So just jump online in the CPD section and you can fill out the self-assessment tool and then manually upload it to your logbook. So it's not done automatically like webinars. So that and you get 1 CPD point per learning hour.
Great. So almost 1.5.
For that. Yeah.
Round up. All right, I think that's it from us. Anything else that you'd like to cover off, Kelly, before we head off, or Ross, before we sign off?
No, that's it from my side. It was great to have such interesting discussion tonight from 4 very diverse sports. So thank you to our presenters and speakers. It was really interesting. And thanks to you, Amy, and to Ross for facilitating discussion, and to everyone that jumped in the chat. It was really interesting, and I think we'll be sharing this one nationally, so hopefully a lot more of our peers will be able to access this and get the benefit as well. So thanks everyone for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks all. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, guys.
Well done, Roscoe.